Hoki, and thank you for joining us on this learning journey together. My name is Emily Van Dyke. I'm Sisika and have served as our volunteer-led Native American alumni of Harvard University Shared Interest Group, or SIG, as a founding board member since 2007 and as president since 2016. I'm a 2003 graduate of Harvard College and a 2009 graduate of Harvard School of Public Health, which is also when I obtained my MD at the University of Washington. Since early 2019, I've been honored to partner with my fellow Unity SIG leaders who represent Harvard Latino Alumni Alliance, Harvard Black Alumni Society, and Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance as we collaborated to plan and present this long-awaited first ever conference to you. At the outset of Unity Weekend, and given that I am speaking to you from Seattle, Washington, I acknowledge with gratitude that I stand on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the unceded ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, who are still here honoring their traditions and illuminating the future with their perseverance. Because we are gathering as Harvard alumni, we honor the traditional custodians of the land on which Harvard University sits, the Massachusetts tribe and their elders, past, present, and emerging, and we honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the first peoples of Massachusetts. We acknowledge and pay our profound respect to the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples with whom Harvard has ties and declared obligations through its charter, dating back to the university's first 2 decades. The Harvard Charter of 1650 committed our institution to the education of English and Indian youth of this country. From its origins, our alumni community has been anchored and enriched by First Nations peoples from across the Americas and around the world. The land on which Harvard is situated has been a place of learning for millennia. Our acknowledgement serves as a necessary step away from the erasure of these Indigenous histories of perseverance, water and land stewardship, innovation, and allyship. Please feel free to let us know from where you're signing in and give your own land acknowledgement via the chat function. And now it's my pleasure to hand over the virtual mic to my fellow Seattleite and HLAA rockstar, Glenda.
Thanks so much, Emily. Good evening, everyone. My name is Glenda Aldana Madrid, and I'm the Vice President of Reunion for the Harvard Latino Alumni Alliance. I'm also a proud Currierite, Fear the Tree, and member of the college class of 2007. Thank you for joining us today. You are one of more than 3,100 alumni and guests who've registered for the weekend, ranging from the class of 1949 to 2024, and including folks from 83 countries and 47 states. It's disappointing we can't gather in person in Cambridge, but it's wonderful to see that the virtual format has allowed alumni to join us from around the country and globe. The 4 groups we have the honor of representing tonight have long supported each other in amplifying our respective communities' voices and concerns. But it was during our collective efforts to stand up for Harvard's admissions policies that we were reminded of the true power of our united voice and the idea of a unity weekend, a space where our historically excluded communities could all come together to explore and celebrate our similarities and our differences, blossomed. Recognizing that many members of our alumni communities survive different degrees of marginalization within this institution, and that this continues today, we saw this weekend as a crucial opportunity to unpack those experiences, to defy stereotypes by showcasing our diversity and richness, to discuss how to jointly address our concerns, both within and beyond Harvard, and to impress upon the Harvard community at large the priorities of our communities. Priorities such as establishing an ethnic studies program. Priorities such as ensuring the shameful tenure denial to exceptional scholars such as Professor Lorca Garcia Peña does not occur again. Unity Weekend is designed to build community, to build bridges, to build up. We hope this will be the first of many of the Unity Weekends to come. It is my honor now to hand the mic over to my colleague, Yvonne.
Thank you, Glenda. Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome everyone. My name is Yvonne Usiram. I am a 2001 graduate of Harvard College, a 2007 graduate of Harvard Law School, and I have since 2019 served as president of the Harvard Black Alumni Society. The programming for Unity Weekend was developed by and features voices from our 4 organizations, which broadly represent 4 of the myriad intersectional identities that exist within our global alumni community. The impressive roster of panelists you'll hear from this weekend bring wisdom, insight, experience, and perspectives that we hope will engage you. These are important historically underrepresented voices, but we know that they are not the only ones. While the themes and perspectives that we will examine here are not exhaustive, this weekend is an important part of a constellation of engagement opportunities for Harvard alumni, which we hope will extend to the work that each of us supports in our own communities and throughout the globe. In addition to the joint programming that you will see over the course of the Unity Weekend, each of our organizations has also developed individual programming. As many of you know, the Harvard Latino Alumni Alliance began their first ever reunion last week, which continues throughout the month of October. The Native American alumni of Harvard University will feature a discussion on recent Supreme Court decisions affirming tribal sovereignty this coming Sunday, September 26th. And this evening, the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance and the Harvard Black Alumni Society are co-sponsoring a discussion between Celeste Eng and Franklin Leonard on equity in Hollywood and in the arts, which we are thrilled to present to you to kick off the weekend's events. To welcome this evening's first speakers, I now hand it over to Jeannie Park.
Thank you, Yvonne. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeannie Park from the college class of 1983 and president of the Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance. I'm so honored to share this Zoom stage with these three remarkable women who have been an oasis of solidarity and sanity through the last 2.5 years. We have shared successes and occasional disappointments, hope and occasional cynicism, and a lot of ha-ha text reactions. We confess to spending too much time fussing about the style and color of these t-shirts. Last week, we celebrated the first day of pre-K for 2 of our children. And this, for me, is where Unity Weekend starts, with the building of community. Our united community is meant to be joyful and caring, but one with a serious purpose: to lift and embolden Harvard's community of color, including students, faculty, and staff, and to move Harvard to do better on issues of equity. Our vision was to fill Memorial Hall with faces of color, to give Harvard no doubt that our time is now. We must be at the core of every university program and priority. We must have courses about our history and communities, faculty who share our backgrounds and experiences, and more physical and virtual spaces like this where we can come together to celebrate and to work together. We welcome collaborations with other alumni communities, as have already occurred, and are grateful for the allyship of so many of you and your shared interest groups. We also thank the Harvard Alumni Association for their support through these years of planning. Please check out the Unity webinars we have produced throughout the year and send us ideas for new ones. And if someone out there could please end this pandemic, we will be back with a Unity dance party for the ages. And now, a few mundane housekeeping announcements. Closed captioning is available by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. The chat is open and we welcome you to introduce yourself and share a land acknowledgement and any thoughts throughout the sessions. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box. And now I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of our first Unity Weekend session called Crashing the Gates, the Fight for Equity in Hollywood and the Arts. Jeff Yang is from the college class of 1989, and I am forever grateful to him and bonded to him for co-chairing the first Harvard Asian Alumni Summit with me back in 2010, which we modeled on the Harvard Black Alumni Weekends that had gone before. We didn't know then that we were all taking steps toward Unity Weekend. Jeff is one of the country's best-known commentators on Asian American issues, with a particular focus on pop culture, which he chronicles in his upcoming book, Rise. His son, Hudson, now a first year at Harvard, happens to have been the young star of the breakthrough Asian American sitcom, Fresh Off the Boat. All of this makes Jeff the perfect guide for today's conversation. Thank you, Jeff. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeannie. And let me add that doing anything in partnership with Jeannie is always a learning experience, an inspiration, and frankly, a process of clinging on for dear life as she, with all the power, energy, persuasion, and determination, can really move the world. So I thank you so much for inviting me to lead this session. I'm incredibly excited to be part of this conversation, not least because these are two people individually who I've had just really deep and incredible engagement with and conversation about these very issues and putting them together to have them speak on these related topics across the communities which we share. This is something like, I don't know, a little bit of a dream to me. So let's make that dream come true. First, let me introduce Franklin Leonard, a longtime friend, film, television producer, cultural commentator, and the founder and CEO of The Blacklist, which, if you're not aware of it, is a game-changing disruptive force in Hollywood, uplifting and making possible the creation of scripts and film concepts that otherwise might sort of remain moldering on shelves. And they've just, as a result, created a vast number of just cinematic treasures that would otherwise be unavailable. Celeste Eng is the author of the New York Times bestselling novels Little Fires Everywhere, Everything I Never Told You. Her writing has been awarded innumerable prizes, translated to more than 30 languages, and she's just both of them are must follows on social media, I might add. But again, somebody who is thoughtful and perspicacious and provocative. And I welcome both of you guys here and in joining me in this conversation. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
So happy to be here. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Franklin.
So I want to just first begin by having you talk a little bit about your respective journeys. And since this is, after all, our Harvard alumni event, let's begin back where it began and, just share a little bit about how you got to where you got and whether and how Harvard helped to shape that. Let's begin with you, Celeste.
Well, I think that Harvard played a pretty important role, but it wasn't exactly how I thought it would be. A lot of my experience at Harvard, I think, made me aware of some of the issues that need to be fixed. And I mean that in both a positive and a negative way. I grew up in an area where there were very few other Asian Americans. It happened that my neighborhood was, at the time, almost evenly divided between Black and white residents, but there were almost no other Asians. And I was the first year who came in and was like, I'm going to rediscover my Asian heritage. I'm going to connect. I don't speak Cantonese, which is my family's dialect. I didn't grow up around a lot of Asians, so I don't really know a lot of the customs. And when I tried to sort of figure out what being Chinese American meant to me, I realized sort of how complicated these issues are. This isn't just come here, take Chinese classes, which I did, join the Chinese Students Association. I realized that there's a lot more complexity to that I didn't have a lot in common with the experiences of a lot of the students in the Chinese Students Association because of where I'd grown up. And I think just recognizing the complexity of how my family background was going to relate to me, of how Asian students, frankly, were viewed by many other people at the university and without the university, sometimes for valid reasons and sometimes not, I think was a real educational experience in and of itself.
Yeah, and obviously, college is kind of a forcing ground for discovery of identity and negotiation of it. I think for all of us, but maybe especially for Asian Americans, because we often are widely separated from our respective communities. How did you actually go from there to? I want to say choosing to be a writer, but maybe people don't choose to be writers. Writing happens to you.
I think most writers would sort of choose not to be writers if they could figure out how to do that, but I'm wildly unfit for anything else. I did do some writing at Harvard. I think one of the things that actually helped a lot was Let's Go. I don't know if that's even still a thing on campus now, but at the time, it was a place where a lot of people who were interested in doing writing or editing work, but maybe weren't quite artsy enough for the Advocate and maybe weren't quite as journalistic as the Crimson staff, where we could kind of find a place where we could kind of nerd out together. And I liked that. And I liked especially that we had to kind of think about what our place in the world was, because we were writing travel guides. And I think that, looking back now, we were not as aware of the, all of the complications and cultural distinctions that we should have been. But I feel like that was, again, for, kids who were 19, 20, that was sort of an important place to start. So I met a lot of people who were interested in writing when I was working for Let's Go. And it was the first time that I started thinking about whether going into publishing or going into the field of writing was something that I could do. And after I graduated, I got into the writing program at the University of Michigan and kind of went from there.
And from there, it was just, bestsellers after bestsellers.
It was an instantaneous greased slide into success that took like 10 to 12 years of working as a freelance proofreader, working at startups, writing terrible, PowerPoint copy, instant success.
Franklin, I imagine your story is not dissimilar in that sense, but if you could share with us your journey as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think my experience is very similar to Celeste. And I think your point about college, and I think Harvard probably especially being a forcing ground for self-discovery, I think it's true for everyone. I just think that, those of us who are members of historically underrepresented communities on Harvard's campus or sort of in the halls of power, it's even more so because we have those additional layers, intersectionally to deal with. I know for me, I grew up in West Central Georgia. I went to for the most part, all white private high school that I since realized was a segregation academy, like founded in the year right before Brown v. Board. Like my mom got taught there so that we could get a tuition break from me and my siblings. And so Harvard for me was my first, and then, I would go spend the weekends with my Black cousins on the south side of Columbus, Georgia. Harvard was the sort of first wildly diverse environment that I had ever spent a lot of time in. And when I say diverse, I don't just mean Black or white, I mean literally everyone. I took those 4 years as an opportunity to sample and participate in as many communities as I could, both sort of that I felt a cultural alignment with, but also those that I was just sort of intellectually aligned with or socially aligned with. So I did The Advocate, I wrote for Let's Go, I spent a lot of time at the IOP, right? And so for me, it was just an opportunity to explore all of the facets of myself that I thought might be there, and then some that I thought just seemed cool for whatever reason. And that left me when I graduated very unsure of what I wanted to do with my life, because that's an ongoing process that I was just at the very beginning of. And so I did a number of jobs, and had a lot of opportunities that I think that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone to Harvard. So, I helped run a congressional campaign. I drove out to Cincinnati, Ohio the day after I graduated from college. The candidate, John Cranley, who's now running for governor of Ohio, was my teaching assistant in my Warren Court Historical B core class. I went from there and moved to Trinidad and wrote for the Guardian newspaper in part on a traveling fellowship via OCS. I went from there to McKinsey & Company in New York, which was a job that I had been offered during recruiting my senior year of college. And it wasn't really until I got to McKinsey and realized that this was definitely not what I wanted to do, did I start really having a conversation with myself about what it was that I thought I might want to do, no matter how terrifying that leap was. And, I was lucky in that my entire analyst class at McKinsey got laid off with 5-month severance, which allowed me the time to figure that out. And I realized that I was spending a lot of time watching movies and reading about the film industry, and then realizing that I've always loved movies, right? The first thing I did when I got my driver's license was drive a Blockbuster. But it never occurred to me as a Black kid from West Central Georgia that there were jobs other than actor and director, two things I knew that I wasn't going to be, that existed. And at this point, I'm a 23-year-old Harvard graduate who's working at McKinsey & Company, but it still had not actually clicked that it was possible. And so I came out to LA in March of 2003, had a drink with a friend of mine. The friend was a classmate of mine at Harvard who had gone to Stuyvesant with this friend who was working as an assistant at CAA. And that social network that came as a result of my having gone to Harvard is what allowed me to get my first interview and get my first job as an assistant at an agency. And then I've just sort of been, following from one job to the next until launching the Blacklist as my full-time venture about 10 years ago.
I think for people who may not be familiar with the Blacklist, a quick explanation maybe in order. In concise terms, tell us a little bit about what it is and how it's disrupted Hollywood.
So it started, I was working at Leonardo DiCaprio's company. My job was to find good scripts. I felt like I was doing a very bad job of finding good scripts. I mean, and literally, you know, my mom's calling me every week asking if my LSAT scores are still valid. And I'm sitting there reading 20 bad screenplays a weekend saying, no, this is going to be my livelihood. And I needed to solve that problem. And so I surveyed a bunch of my peers and said, send me a list of your 10 favorite unproduced scripts from this year. In exchange, I'll send you the combined list. I sent that back out to everybody who voted anonymously, and it sort of went viral in the industry very quickly. This is in a sort of pre-social media, like YouTube had been around for 5 months. Facebook was still only maybe in a dozen schools. Twitter didn't exist, iPhones didn't exist, et cetera. And it went viral and became an arbiter of taste in the industry very quickly. And a lot of the scripts that were on the list started getting produced. Those movies would do very well. The writers would have, you know, very, very quickly catalyzed careers. And then 9 years ago, we launched a website that allows anybody on earth to upload their screenplay for a fee, have it evaluated. If it's good, we tell everybody in Hollywood, this is a really good screenplay. You should probably do something with it. You know, and we've I think done almost 150,000 script evaluations. Hundreds of writers have gotten signed in the agency and management company world. Movies have been produced. We're partnered with every writers guild in the English-speaking language except for Australia, and we have partners with MGM, Warner Media, all designed around the fundamental premise that there is great talent everywhere, and especially in the places that the industry has historically not looked for it. And not only are those writers better off by our finding them, but the industry is better off for having an infrastructure that allows us to identify talent at scale and try to create something that better approximates a real meritocracy, which is something that Hollywood has failed to do since its inception.
Yes, meritocracy, that most loaded of phrases, especially when uttered around Harvard. Let me just say that it's a terrific segue to the meat of our conversation. And of course, the title of this talk is Crashing the Gates, and it's about equity in Hollywood and the arts. And kind of in keeping with the back to school element of this conversation, in our initial talks around this, I noted that you kind of have to interrogate every word in the phrase equity in the arts. And I thought we could begin by doing that, starting with equity. And when we talk about equity, what do we really mean? I mean, from your from how you've described Blacklist, for instance, it's really equity of opportunity, equality of opportunity. But equity can mean different things for different people. And I would just like to throw it out to you, both of you, what your thoughts are when you are challenged to say, what do you think of when you think of equity? What does it look like?
Celeste, you want to take this one?
I was going to say, Franklin. Well, I mean, to jump off sort of what you were talking about, one of the things that there's many amazing things about the Blacklist, but one of the things that I think is really great is, in a sense, that it is, it's providing sort of a base level of knowledge and sort of a place where people can come to get feedback, because, you know, we're Harvard alums, right? You have connections. I know that people gave me a second look because they saw Harvard on my resume. Absolutely. I know that, you know, people that I knew, we had a class together one time, they remember my name, are more likely to give me a chance, right? If you don't have those connections, which especially in the arts, especially if you are from an underrepresented community, it is really hard to get those connections. Sure. How do you even start? And that's one of the things that I think that is so revolutionary about the Blacklist, in that, you know, you've got on there, like, here are the standards for writing a TV series script, right? Here's how you can do it, because it seems like something that, you know, nobody should have to tell you, but how are you going to know that stuff? And that's something, I mean, I'm a fiction writer, obviously, and I'm thinking about it sort of from the publishing side, but how do you get that first leg up? How do you even get the door open to you and feel like this is even something that you know the basics of how to do? Even something as simple as, like, you should be writing your script in 12-point Courier, or you should be writing your manuscript in, you know, probably Times New Roman and double space it. And, like, you know, these things that don't seem like they should matter, but serve as these sort of signifiers that, okay, you can be in the club. So when I'm thinking, this is a very long-winded answer to your question, Jeff, and I'm not even sure it's working its way around to an answer, but I feel like part of equity has to do with not just, okay, we're opening up the call for everybody. Anybody bring us your stuff. Now we've got equity. I think you really have to look at all the levels in which all kinds of factors have kept people outside the gates, to go back to the term that we're using. that's very daunting, but I feel like it isn't just one thing. It is in fact kind of peeling away all the layers and trying to remove as many barriers as possible, not just giving more people, something taller to stand on so they can get over the barrier, but actually kind of bringing the barriers down for everybody. Even at the very, very basic level of how do you do this? How do you art?
Franklin, yes. How do you art? But equity, yeah.
Well, look, I feel like my thinking on this evolves constantly and more rapidly of late, especially as I sort of confront the realities that like a lot of my instincts about the way things were working were right, and that and then upon realizing that, what does it mean to make substantive change? And so recently I've been thinking about it, looking at the question of what equity looks like, not from the position of the people who are seeking opportunity, but from the perspective of the people who stand to benefit from those people's getting those opportunities. And so from that perspective, equity to me looks like anybody who has talent has the opportunity to live their artistic ambitions at scale, right? And that everybody has an equal opportunity based on their talent. I personally, and this might be a controversial statement, I don't have a problem with gates existing in highly financed cultural institutions, as long as the sort of penetration of those gates is guided by a nuanced and complex concept of what talent and merit looks like, and not the traditional sort of conception of merit that we've relied on as conventional wisdom for as long as Hollywood has existed, right? Because I think Hollywood needs great talent, right? And we need to be able to identify that great talent and put with them the resources that allows them to exercise that talent. So those are the things that I've been thinking about. I wish I could say that I had an answer to what does equity look like and how do we measure it, but I don't know that that's necessarily a perfectly quantifiable thing. And I think thinking about it in pure quant terms is particularly dangerous.
Yeah, as I think we've seen in many circles. But you do bring up something I think that's intrinsic to this conversation, and it does bring up the next word in that phrase, which is in, right? Who gets to be in? And what does inside mean? I'm actually moved a little bit to raise a conversation that you inadvertently had on social media, on Twitter, about the concept of nepotism. And it went viral, of course, because several people, like, for instance, Ben Stiller, responded decrying the idea that nepotism has anything to do with success in Hollywood. Ben Stiller, who is the son of Jerry Stiller. And that, I think, is at the crux in some ways of this notion of the gates, right? Yes, we can't have a world entirely without gates, but at the same time, there are some people for whom the gates are an easy pass, openable kind of thing, and others who do not have that privilege. And the privilege could come from being alumni of a school, or it could come from knowing somebody on the inside, or it could come from being offspring of somebody, or it could come from the color of your skin. And Franklin, I just wanted to ask you your thoughts around that. I mean, given the fact that Hollywood especially is a clubby place.
Yeah, I mean, just for some context for people that aren't familiar with my Twitter, what Jeff's referring to is a conversation that I had with Ben Stiller. There was a Deadline.com, which is sort of Hollywood trade story, about a short film that was being made, directed by the daughter of a sort of big A-list director, starring the son of a big A-list star, written by the son of a big blue chip novelist. And I made a sort of snarky comment, but Hollywood's a meritocracy, right? When I made that comment, to be clear, I didn't realize that it was a short film. And actually, like, I'm rooting for all of the participants in that short film to make something amazing, because we're all better off if there's more amazing stuff in the world, right? If my sort of ire was directed anywhere, it was actually a Deadline for sort of covering that short film as though it were a story that merited notice amidst all of the other stories that they could be covering within the industry. Anyway, long story short, Ben Stiller responded and said, easy criticism, everybody has their own path, you should wish them well. To which I responded, And I do. And everyone does have their own path. I just think that we should be honest about what those paths are. And to that, he responded, look, at the end of the day, Hollywood's a meritocracy, so it all works out. And that was, a statement that I took some amount of again, additional ire with. To Ben's credit, I think that we had a very sort of respectful conversation and eventually he agreed that this was not something that he had thought much about. And I think that what I'd say is, I have no, like, if your parents work in the business and you want to work in the business, cool, do amazing work. I will be there front row with my popcorn and Coca-Cola. I'm in. But I think it's really important that all of us acknowledge the various advantages that we have in this life that allow us to get there more easily than someone who may be more talented than us, but didn't have the same opportunities. So for me, I'm a straight cis dude who grew up upper middle class and went to Harvard. Yes, I'm Black, but I have had all of these other advantages that have allowed me to be in the position that I'm in, that I definitely would not be in if it weren't for all of those other advantages that I had. And I know darn well that there were more talented people at Harvard than I who could be working in Hollywood right now doing just as much, if not more than I, had they had the sort of flexibility to jump ship and take a low-paying job for several years. There are people from my hometown in Columbus that are more talented than I that didn't have those opportunities. I was lucky. I acknowledge it, and some of my work is designed to make sure that that advantage is not the sole trajectory determiner of everybody that comes behind me.
Yeah, I think I think so much of that defensiveness that happens when people are sort of asked to just acknowledge the privileges they have is a lot of guilt. And I feel like we don't, as a society maybe, or maybe just as a species, we're not very good at figuring out how to deal with that guilt. But I feel like a lot of it is just like what you said, Franklin, like similarly, like I am an Asian American, which brings me some disadvantages, but I grew up, like upper middle class. I had parents who, were able to get educated and put my education first and were able to send me to Harvard, right? I got into Harvard. I got, so many things that helped me out, and so many other writers that are out there that probably, write books that are 10 times better, than mine. And
That's
so
a very high standard, Celeste.
Well, I think it's
10 times
I mean,
is 10 times is a lot.
I'm not even being modest. I mean, I'm constantly stunned whenever I read books and I'm like, you can do that? I want to do that. How do you do that? Right. And I feel like that's it just sort of goes to show that I think a lot of this problem too has to do with this idea that we have limited attention and limited resources. Like you're saying, deadline can only cover so many things. And so part of the problem is that the things that they choose to cover are, that attention is in itself a commodity too, right? And it's like you said, it's not that we don't want to support those things, but it's the idea that, okay, if that's getting made, are other people getting cut out of opportunities, right? Are they going to not do this other film because they're like, oh, we've already got this other film? I mean, that's something that at least happens in the book world all the time. People will get told, oh, we're not going to publish your book because we already have an Indian book. We've already got this one, we already published, Arundhati Roy. So we're good. We're good on Indian people, right? Yeah. They're like, there
aren't enough Indian people to sustain book sales.
Right.
Is really the problem.
And substitute that for, like Asian or any, subgroup of Asian Black people. They say all the time, I mean, like, they're like, yeah, we're not going to publish you. Cause I mean, don't you already have Toni Morrison? I think you're good. Right. Like, that idea of scarcity, I feel like, is at the root of so much of this. Like, if there weren't the sense that, the Ben Stiller films, which like I would love to see, are in some ways removing resources from other people who could have them, this whole conversation, I think, would be less fraught.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge, though, that we are talking about removing resources to some people, because exactly. Like at the end of the day, yeah.
Yep.
Some people here's the other reality I'd say. If people were always like, affirmative action, why are we giving all these people opportunities? It's like, look, here's the thing. No one is saying that 75% of the movies that Hollywood makes should be directed by Black people or women, right? We're just, I mean, look, it wouldn't be the worst thing that happened. I'm just saying, but like, I don't know of any advocates that are advocating for that. Yeah. We're aiming for population parity as a start, right? Because we're nowhere near that, what that means is that if you assume that the ability to tell stories well is a talent that is, reasonably equally distributed amongst various demographics, the only overrepresented people, the only people that are getting affirmative action, the only people that are getting hired in part significantly because of their identity is straight white guys, right? And so they lack the talent to compete in an open field with everybody else who's not having to, do it backwards and in heels, work twice as hard to get half as far, insert your sort of cliche for being a member of an underrepresented community and having to succeed here. So I think that at the end of the day, the goal here is create a system or build towards a system where the point is the talent. And talent is defined as a more sort of multivariate thing that is representative of the kinds of things that the audience, which is multivariate and diverse, consumes. Because I think the assumption about a lot of this stuff is, oh, well, the Indian book or the Asian book or the Black book, these are inherently niche by virtue of who's writing them. But the fact of the matter is, there's no evidence that backs that claim. And there's a lot of statistical evidence, including a lot of which was done by Stacy Smith at the University of Southern California, that would argue otherwise, that Black film overperforms dollar for dollar at the box office, that movies that pass the Bechdel test overperform at the box office relative to their counterparts when controlling for all other factors. So I actually don't know what the punctuation at the end of that is, but I think that at the end of the day, these are the sort of common issues.
Yeah.
I think you might be right.
Point.
I think you might be right.
I want to add one layer to this, which I think, in addition to the opportunity to succeed, there's I think a very clear need for us to give people opportunities to fail. And what I mean by that is, or to be mediocre, right? Yeah. There's a very strong sense, and this is something which my podcast co-host, Phil Yu, helped coin, this term rep sweats, right? Which is basically every time you see something that includes or that demonstrates the talent or the storytelling of your community, you just erupt in perspiration, because you know that if it fails or if it's bad, it may salt the earth and eliminate all possibility for another thing to come for the next 25 years. And I think that we're finally getting to a point where people can make, movies that are not successful and not fear for the entirety of their represented tribes, communities, cultures, et cetera. But we're not fully there yet. And it's very clear that there still is that stigma that if you come from a recognizable, marginalized population, that you are required to represent that population. And what I want to do is pull that back into the last two words, of the arts, right? We talk about the arts in the sort of very abstract sense, but the arts are very diverse, and their participants are even more so. A lot of times we can't always represent and shouldn't be representing the larger extrapolated network of us. What do you guys say about that? Because Celeste, even from your perspective, you haven't necessarily been writing within that specific chapter of literature, the sort of Asian American bookshelf, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, when I started writing, I was always frustrated because people would hear that I wanted to write fiction and they go, "Oh, so you want to be the next Amy Tan?" And I'm like, no. I like Amy Tan a lot. I appreciate everything she's done. I like her fiction, but I'm also like, I do something different. And also I still want her to be around. There's this idea that you're like, it's like Highlander, like you can only have one. And if you ever run into each other, you have to fight to the death until only one of you is left, right? And I feel like moving away from that idea is so crucial because, we're still stuck with that idea that you can only have like this one story to take, I think Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said it really, really well. It's the idea that you've got the one story and it puts this impossible pressure on the story to both represent everyone and also to to bear all of the weight and all the expectations of those things. I'm thinking about, we've been talking about film. I'm thinking about Crazy Rich Asians, which, whatever you think about the film, came under some criticism for saying, well, but you're not representing all Asians. And I'm like, this is true. It says right in the title, right? And you can talk about whether or not it should be representing more Asians or not. It's representing a very small subset of them. But part of that problem, again, is that idea that you're only going to get the one shot. And I think when we're talking about, when we know if we've made real progress, part of it is going to be that feeling that it's okay to represent maybe one aspect of one group's experience. And it's okay to maybe fail at that and not worry that you're going to be judged solely on that. I'm thinking too about like Shang-Chi. I saw an article just recently that was like, it's testing the limits of how ready America is for an Asian film. And I'm like, is it though? Because you're right, you're like, we're only judging it on the one thing, apparently, because that's all it can be. That's all it's got. And I don't know exactly how to move past that. Like Franklin said, I don't know what the punctuation at the end of this is, but it's so wrapped up in that for me.
I mean, the frustrating thing is that if we were judged on the one thing, we'd be clear of this by now, because we've had so many one things that are super successful. Like, okay, sure, judge us on Black Panther, judge us on Crazy Rich Asians, judge us on Shang-Chi, judge us on Moonlight, like judge us on, anything Issa Rae does or Oprah does, or, I mean, like, the problem is that, and I think this is, we talk a lot about in the Black community, the Black tax, this idea that, not only do you have to do the work, but you have to have all of these other considerations about sort of your community and how you're representing it and making sure that you're mentoring and doing all these things. And I imagine it's the same in other communities. Our white peers don't really have to think about that. They're not worried about representing the white community when they make their films or when they live their lives. And so I think your point is dead on, Celeste, that at the end of the day, it's about there being more stuff, because if there's more stuff, you're gonna get more representation, and everything is not gonna feel quite so freighted as like, oh, we gotta get this one right. If I don't see myself in it, it's gonna be decades before I have the chance to again, and therefore
and you're screwing over everyone else in your community, right? That sense of obligation.
So I think you're right. Again, it's very much a ... And I think that all of this stuff, I think that we're in a moment right now where people are talking a lot about it. And I can't figure out what percentage of that talk is just talk. I suspect it's very high. But really, the question is going to be not each individual movie that comes out over the next 10 years and whether or not those movies represent everybody. It's going to be about, has the system changed? Or is it the same system run by the same people that has been run by since, the advent of Hollywood?
Yeah, are we actually getting more, are we actually getting multiplicity? Are we actually getting more different kinds of stories and different kinds of good work out there? Franklin, something that you said, that white people, generally speaking, don't have to think about all of those other considerations that underrepresented groups have. It reminded me too of what you were saying when you had that Twitter conversation with Ben Stiller, which I remember watching play out in real life, that he had not thought about that, which I'm like, I feel like that's so much of it. And I feel like to go back to the earlier question about what equity is, in some ways, equity, it's so often, I think, seen as like, what are we giving to the groups that haven't gotten things? And to a certain extent, maybe that's part of it, but part of it also is like, can we maybe have some equity in who has to think about these things and who has to be making, being considerate of others or giving up resources, for example. And I feel like, if more of the white majority is starting to have to think about those things, that would also be an important part of equity, being like, oh, I'm aware of an issue that wasn't aware to me. I wasn't aware before. It seems so small and yet seems also like a crucial thing.
I've joked on Twitter for several years now, and I re-up the tweet from time to time, but I would love to see a conference on whiteness in Hollywood. And I'd love to see interviews with the various folks who run companies and ask them very, very clearly, like, there are two specific questions. One is, how would the trajectory of your career have been different if you were not a white man? And the second is to what extent do you think that racism has affected your company's financial bottom line, and what have you done to address it?
I think that most people in Hollywood probably labor under the belief that the sort of racist and racialized pillars upon which the industry has stood have largely been protective of them and have been sort of the profitable pillars, that have uplifted Hollywood.
Well,
I think what you're saying is that it's almost certain that the opposite is true, that in many ways Hollywood could have been much bigger, much more successful had it not been resting on those foundations to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put a very fine point on it, and people can Google this to read the study in full. I was a peripheral part of the McKinsey & Company study that was released earlier this year, specifically looking at Black Hollywood, anti-Black bias, and the economic consequences of it for the companies that make up the industry. And what McKinsey & Company found, noted social justice lawyers McKinsey & Company, this is not me saying this, is that Hollywood loses $10 billion of revenue per year as a consequence of anti-Black bias. That's just anti-Black bias. That doesn't count bias against the Latinx community, the Asian community, against women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+, et cetera. So as an industry, we're leaving tens of billions of dollars on the table annually as a consequence of folks being bad at making good decisions about how to allocate resources. And it's partially said in jest, but it's sort of true. I'm not offended by that as a Black man. I'm offended by that as a person who would like to make a little bit more money and be able to provide for my children someday, right? Like, if you can't, in very few other places in the world, if I was a basketball player and I was that bad at playing basketball, I would not make an NBA roster, right? Yeah. And I think that that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. There's a moral and ethical imperative to all of this stuff, but there is also a financial imperative. And it is staggering to me the extent to which people are so attached to their biases that they're letting those biases prevent them and me from getting a bigger bag and being able to watch better movies and television.
I mean, that is such a good point. And it's similar in the publishing world as well. There is a real hesitance to actually make more diverse books and have more diverse staff. And the thing is, it's exactly what you said. It is not just a moral and ethical decision, although there is obviously that component of it. It also lets you make better choices. It lets you make better art. You find more art and it's better. I think this is true of really any decision. My sister was a STEM educator for a long time. She would teach teachers how to teach STEM. And I promise this is related. And she would do an activity with them where there are all these teachers who do different things, and she'd make them solve some kind of strange problem that they did not usually have to deal with. And what they always found was that they were pulling on different aspects of their experience. So like somebody was a knitter, so they knew how to, handle things with string, and somebody else had studied this history, so they understood things. I mean, it's like the escape room kind of thing. And this is a long-winded way of saying that diversity is a benefit to everybody, right? A financial benefit as well as a cultural and moral benefit. It just makes you work better if you have other people who can see stuff that you can't see, right? Like if any argument is actually going to make change, I wonder if it will be the one that you're making, Franklin, to the industry, to be like, you could make more money. This could be better for you in addition, because I feel like, the arguments about this is the right thing to do only convince so many people.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I've also joked that the industry is a little bit like the NBA right before integration, right? Where like, if you allow everybody to compete, the quality of the game is going to get better. Basketball as an industry is going to be more valuable. Just maybe don't fill the roster with only people that are 1 degree removed from the social networks of the people that own the team.
And that, I think, speaks a lot to the efforts you're making with the Blacklist, for one, kind of opening the doors to people who aren't necessarily intrinsically connected already to the industry. But I am getting some pressure to move to Q&A, which I will do. I did want to ask one last question, and this is a one which could take a ton of time, but I'm asking you to, just sort of comment on it from the standpoint of this sort of more nuanced levels by which we are now being held to charge when we create stories. There's now that second set of questions around how authentic is the story you're telling? What propers do you have, if you will, to tell that story? And it is something which I think is a criticism that's forcing people within communities to interrogate themselves. I wanted to just throw that out there because that is almost like the next level, right? Getting the opportunity to tell stories is the first thing. Getting the opportunity to tell stories and then telling them in a way that feels true and rich and has integrity, I suppose, is a thing people are talking a lot about now. But those are, again, fraught words as well. What are your thoughts around those conversations?
Franklin's looking at me.
Yeah, specifically, you know what I'm talking about, but there's that sense of like, who gets to tell the Asian story, the Asian American story, the Asian immigrant story. Yeah.
I think this is going to sound wishy-washy, and I don't mean to dodge the question, but I do think we don't know the answers. There aren't clear-cut answers to that. The thing is, those are conversations we have to have. We can talk about specific examples about them. There are tons of them, even just, from the past week of media news. But I feel like, again, I want to zero in on that word, like, who gets to tell the Asian American story? And that's part of the problem, is shifting away from that idea. Not to call you on it, Jeff, but that's the idea that everyone says there's the Asian American story. This is part of it. Like, it is important, for example, for Asian Americans to think about the ways that they have interacted historically with the Black community, generally not great, and think about the ways that they have appropriated things from the Black community and what is appropriated. And I don't know where those lines are, right? But I'm thinking about Awkwafina, obviously, because this is something that's been in the news recently. And I think it's important to have a conversation. I don't know what the outcome is, but I think it is important to say, okay, if someone is upset about what's happening, that's something worth listening to and talking about it. And I don't know that we're going to zero in on a place, but I feel like there's a lot of fatigue in going, oh, but now we're slicing things so thin about who gets to tell these stories. I'm like, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that having those discussions and thinking about identity and who has a reason to tell a story, and are they telling it with respect and telling it well, I don't think that that's a bad thing to put more attention on that.
Yeah, I actually agree with Celeste in the main there. I think at the end of the day, again, it can't just, the question can't be about one individual story. It has to be about the systems that choose who gets the opportunity to tell stories, what gets supported within that ecosystem, and sort of what gets perpetuated as a consequence of that. And everybody always says, well, write what you know, right? Like, okay, that doesn't mean that I only want to watch like my own experience. I think it's write what you've researched well, write what you've done the work to have some fundamental understanding of. I think I should be able to write a novel about an Asian woman, but I damn well better do the work to do it well. And if I haven't, it's probably going to come out in the wash. And I think that it's more likely that people, if there is criticism, there are very few people that are going to back me, because they're like, he doesn't even know any Asian women. Why is he doing this? Right. So I think that fundamentally, like, we have to think about it more like that. And I also think we have to think about who's making the decisions about who gets access to resources. And who sort of, is it a question of another older white guy writing a Black story or making the decision about greenlighting a Black story? Or are things moving upstream or moving differently? Because all of that context matters. But at the end of the day, it's really about the quality and the work that the person puts in to do the research necessary to make authentic art about a community. It's very hard for me to imagine anybody doing a terribly exceptional job winging it in that respect.
Yeah,
it might be possible, but as an artist, you're taking a very big risk in even making that attempt, and good luck to you. But maybe that's not your ministry.
Yeah, I think especially in the writing world, we talk so much about, your fiction is supposed to be able to put yourself in other people's minds and choose. And yes, it is, but it's like you said, you have to do the work. And part of that work is also thinking about, why is this a story that I need to tell? Right.
That's
and that thinking about it in those terms, I think is going to be a big part of it.
There's actually a comment from Sheila in the chat, which I think is very relevant here, which is there is a particular burden on people of color to have to tell, quote unquote, the story, right? That burden of representation sits upon us or heavily. And that question isn't actually asked of, of white artists in, quite the same way, right? Does that impact the way that you actually look at your respective artistic spaces? The fact that, until very recently anyway, if you were a white person who wanted to tell any story, you kind of had that normative right to do so. But if you're somebody who is Black or Asian or Native, and you wanted to tell a certain other kind of story, a story that's outside of your own bounds, then people would raise that as a question. From what grounds do you write that particular story?
Yeah, I think that's another advantage that sort of white people have had in the culture industries as long as they've existed. I mean, look, I'll be damned if I cede the opportunity to work with, Bong Joon-ho and make a Korean story, right? Like, you're not going to take that right away from me. I'm going to figure out how to work with him before the end of my career. But again, I think that that's a right that is earned. I would have to do the work for director Bong to think that I was worthy of even being like in the same room with him to talk about movies. And so again, I think that we all have to do that work to earn the right to tell the stories that we're trying to tell. And that's not just limited based on our identity. It's also based on like doing the research about like what the job of the person that is our protagonist, or like what time period the thing is set in, or, fully imagining the sci-fi or fantasy world that we're creating. It's no different. It's doing the work. It just so happens that we're talking about doing work that actually involves real people who have real reason to be deeply skeptical about the ways in which our stories have been told and by whom across the history of sort of commercial storytelling in America.
Yeah. I see a question here from Mario Moore, which is about whether or not the perception that because the arts are less inclusive, less diverse, that isn't its own wall, that therefore, young, talented people are simply turned away before they even reach the gates because they feel it's something that they can't possibly succeed in. And I want to add another layer, which is in many cases, our parents may say, hey, that's not something you really want to do. It's insecure, it's dangerous, it's risky. That's not why we came here.
This is something I'm thinking about a lot. And I think my thinking on this has evolved. When I was a teenager, I mean, my dad was a physicist, my mom is a chemist, my sister is an engineer. I have lost track of how many engineers I have in my family. And then I wanted to be a writer. And my parents were supportive, but not at all thrilled. I would say supportive is a generous assessment. And I used to think it was there's the stereotype about how Asian parents basically want you to be a business person or a doctor. Maybe scientist is okay. That's basically it, right? That's what they came here for, to get you to become a, neurosurgeon. And there's this idea that there's this cultural pressure for that's what's valued. And maybe that's part of it. But I realize as I've gotten older, how much of it did have to do with what you're saying, Jeff, of feeling like my parents were like, I don't know if that's a world that will like you. I don't know if that's a world that will ever let you in the door. The novelist Kevin Nguyen, who's Vietnamese American, said in an interview where his mother said, I don't know if I want you to go into the arts because I don't want your life to be hard, which I thought was such a heartbreaking way of saying it, that I think it does scare away a lot of people. And if you see other people doing it, it starts to seem possible in a way that it hasn't before. And if you start to see just, again, more of it, I guess that's the answer we keep coming back to, maybe that will start to change the minds of the parents and the writers who want to do it. It's such a self-selecting system in a lot of ways to dive in and go, I'm going to go into this field that's really difficult, really subjective, and probably isn't going to make a lot of money, and I'm going to stick to it. Who in their right minds does that?
I think it's really interesting. I have a theory that the parents who want their kids to go into doctor, lawyer, engineer has actually less to do with sort of racially or sort of nationally specific culture and more to do with class. And I don't have the numbers to back this up, and I'd be very curious to look at them sort of cross-culturally, because my theory, like, I don't think that the desire to be a storyteller, the desire to be an artist is culture. Like, there are storytellers and artists in every culture around the world for as long as human beings have existed, and the desire to be a storyteller has existed. And I don't think that when we're kids, we're even aware enough of like who's directing things and who's writing books that we read and what their identity is to say, oh, I can't do that because whatever. I think our parents, and this is true, I see this in the Black community, I see it in the Asian community, I see it in the Jewish community. It's like, we don't want you to go and do that because that's subjective.
Mhm.
We want you to go into a career where at the end of the day, if you're good, you're good.
Yes.
And doctor, lawyer, engineer, there are
Nobody-
quantitative numbers that we can back that up. We don't want you having to walk into a room and pitch people and decide, well, I see myself in this person, so I'm going to make sure that they're successful.
Absolutely.
I
And
actually,
so I
just
have
to-
a theory that that's animating it far more than anything else. I could be wrong.
Absolutely agree.
I don't disagree, except for one point, which I feel like it's not just about success, it's about lack of success, right? It's about
Yes.
security.
It's about
And-
security. Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's absolutely right. No, I totally agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
And because I think that I certainly think that if my Black parents, my father who grew up in West Central Georgia, whose father grew up in West Central Georgia, I think if he thought that I could have gotten a fair shake, I think they would have been less skeptical, less concerned, less cautious about it, and less sort of focused on driving me towards something that was, doctor, lawyer, engineer. Perfect example. My younger brother, brilliant soccer player, very, very smart. They had no concerns about him being a professional soccer player. Because at the end of the day, if you're good enough, you're going to make a roster.
Mhm.
And he did, and played in the MLS for 7 years. And then he retired and went to medical school. Point is that sports weren't a concern for them because they knew that if he had it, he would be okay. The arts, very different proposition. And I think that was their fear, whether they were aware of it rationally or not. I think that's where it comes from.
I think that's dead on. I mean, looking back, I always thought, oh, my parents don't, they don't care about books, which is totally untrue. My house was full of books. My dad read books, even as I was like, I thought he didn't support my writing. And I realize now, I think it's exactly what you were saying, that they wanted a place where, I think about my mom's phrase, where no one can argue that you weren't good enough. Right? That idea that like, okay, so you got the right number on all of these math problems. No one can argue that wasn't right.
Yeah.
Right. And so much of it, I think, again, has to do with, I think you're completely right about class. Like, my parents were immigrants. My dad was on scholarship all through his grade school, all through college. My mom, both of them were the first in their families to finish high school. Like, I can only imagine what they were thinking when they came over here and they're, trying to work their way up, and their kids like, I'm going to go be a writer, right? Like, they're kind of like, I want you to have food. I want you to have a stable life. I want you to have, like a roof over your head. Like, so much of it is economics, and it's not, I've come to think more and more, it's not about some kind of cultural devaluing of arts or anything. That so much of it is all of the context around it.
I think it's the opposite. I mean, Celeste, you mentioned that your house was filled with books. Your parents were always reading. The Blacklist had a podcast where we would interview filmmakers and actors, and I was struck by the number. And for whatever reason, the Asian American filmmaker guests are sort of just occurring to me right now. All of whom were first generation. All of whom, we asked people like, where did you first fall in love with movies? Where did you first see movies? To a person, every single one of them, like, my parents love movies. And so the idea that, like, of course they're overwhelmed with joy that their kids did this thing that they loved, but I don't think they necessarily wanted to risk their kids' security to have that. Whereas, you can look at the numbers about sort of household net worth. There's a lot more security amongst families that are white just because of the history of the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have room for one more question. I wish I could ask more of these Q&A questions, but I did want to pose one last one for you. And that really speaks to the future and what you still have not yet seen that you might see, that for you might serve as a real milestone, a real piece of evidence, perhaps, that things have truly, truly changed. If you could actually identify just some event, some phenomenon, some occurrence that you haven't seen in your industries yet that would represent to you that we had in fact truly pivoted, truly had a sea change, and not simply something that could be yanked back into oblivion, what would it be?
I don't know about anything, like one data point that's going to convince me to fly a mission accomplished banner. I feel like history's taught me enough that we need a couple more than one. I'll throw one out there though, because I think that I can speak to sort of the fact that it should have happened already, but it hasn't. Give me a year where all 5 nominees for Best Director are women of color.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because here's why I say that specifically. Women of color represent roughly like what, or even just 5 women, period, are the nominees. And we have a reasonable mix of women of color in the mix. You know, women are half the population, 5 nominees should happen statistically once every 32 years. I don't think we've had a year where more than one woman's been nominated, right? So, and people are like, well, why should all the nominees be women? Why have all the nominees been men for all of history? So yeah, give me a year like that, and I'll start to be optimistic that the system is changing. But what I would also say is this: the system's going to change whether people like it or not, because if the talent that can't get purchased in the traditional system, the resources and sort of tools are there to go outside the system and create business models that are sustainable now. And so the industry, if they fail to get it together and recognize what change is necessary for their business outcomes, they will cease to be relevant culturally, and their business outcomes will continue to get worse and worse. So, you know, change now and benefit from the change, or try to change later and, you know, be sunk on the Titanic that's already sunk.
Yeah.
Celeste?
I agree with you, Franklin, that I'm wary of putting any, you know, sort of one data point up as being like, you know, the important marker of change. I feel like it's going to have to be a whole constellation of data points. But I'm going to go back to what we were talking about earlier. The idea that you could have a project by an underrepresented group come out and bomb, and it didn't cut off opportunities for other people. There's I was talking to a friend who's a screenwriter, Charlie Yu, whose book, Interior Chinatown.
I'm so excited for this.
Oh, I'm so excited
man.
for that. But so I knew him as a fiction writer first, but he's now a screenwriter, and his book won the National Book Award, which I was thrilled about. And we were talking about what are we hoping for? How do we know, you know, that we're going to make progress? And he said, when you get to have an Asian American character who is like a complete failure, who's not exceptional in any way, not the doctor, not the successful business person, not the person who has it together, but is some kind of loser on screen, he's like, I feel like that'll be progress. And I see what he's saying in the sense that you're no longer being asked to, you know, be twice as good to get half as much. You're no longer being asked to, you know, do 150% in order for people to think you might be good enough for the job. You're no longer going to have a movie that has to, you know, break every box office record or have, you know, some one superstar, you know, mega selling book. And then that's, you're no longer going to be a liability to your community if your project is not breaking every record. I feel like that'll be some kind of progress.
Well, that is those are two things which I think will stand pretty well at the least, if not as examples of fundamental, perfect change. At least something that in our lifetimes maybe can make us feel like we've gotten a little return on our investment of time. So thank you guys so much for sharing us this time in this conversation. You're just so brilliant and so fun, and I love talking to you guys, whether virtually or in person, and I hope I'll see you guys in person sometime soon.
Back
Thank
at
you
you.
so much, Jeff, and thank you, Franklin. I wish we could talk for another hour.
Same. Soon.
Well, with that, I'm going to turn over things to Emily Van Dyke for the rest of tonight's Unity program. Thank you guys again so much for giving us this opportunity.
Wow. I'm just sitting with that for a moment. Thank you so much, Jeff, Celeste, and Franklin, for that amazing power panel. to coin Jennifer Kahn's apt phrase from the chat. Welcome to everyone who has joined us for our opening night of Unity Weekend. It's my honor to introduce our next speaker. By now, many of you are quite familiar with Larry Bacow, Harvard University's 29th president. You can see his full biography via the link in the chat, where you will note his previous roles as president of Tufts University, chancellor of MIT, and as a Harvard degree holder 3 times over. Without further ado, here is President Larry Bacow.
Good evening, everyone. I'm President Bacow, but I'd appreciate if all of you would just call me Larry. Everyone does. I'd like to start by thanking the 4 extraordinary organizations that have brought us all together this evening. The Harvard Asian American Alumni Alliance, the Harvard Black Alumni Society, the Harvard Latino Alumni Alliance, and the Native American Alumni of Harvard University. More specifically, I'd like to thank the leaders of these organizations whom you've just met. Glenda, Jeannie, Yvonne, and Emily, thank you for your dedication to Harvard and to the alumni community. As I thought about what I might want to say to you today, I thought about the ease in which I ask people throughout our community to address me as Larry. I do this for a reason. I do it to students, to faculty, to staff, but also to alumni and others. I want everyone to feel more comfortable approaching me as just another fellow member of our community, and not necessarily as the president of Harvard University. Unfortunately, one of the challenges of being president is the title always precedes you, and I try and play that down as much as I can. My goal is to make everyone feel welcome and to make sure that everyone feels that they belong at this special place. One of the things I've learned through my first 3 years as president is that how you feel about your role in this community often depends upon who you are. Unfortunately, not everyone feels the same. Not everyone feels welcome or as if they belong. It's important that we work together to address these issues. It's certainly why I'm here with all of you today. Throughout the Harvard network, we need to ensure that we build and support communities in connection, conversation, and understanding. Your being here today is part of that. So thank you. Thank you for making this a priority and being part of this weekend. I'm fond of saying that we must consider what kind of community do we want to be, but our work in the present does not stand alone. It's connected inextricably to our past. We've inherited an institution, an ancient institution, 386 years old, that's been shaped by those who've come before us. And in many respects, some of these people existed to preserve the status quo, but others existed to challenge that status quo, to question it, and to try to think hard about how we could be a better Harvard. If veritas, truth, is not only our motto, but also our goal and our aspiration, we must encourage truth-seeking wherever it takes us, not just in the way in which we look forward, but we also must have the strength and the courage to look backward as well, to see Harvard as its people once saw it as it once was, and to understand the ways in which the choices of those who came before us, both large and small, led each of us to this room today. Across the university, we're bringing our mission of teaching and research to the task of reconsideration, reckoning, and reform. I believe these efforts not only inform our present, but also shape our future in profound ways, and believe that that is the work of all of us. But the alumni community, especially communities built across differences, hold a special role. You help us see Harvard as we are, but also as we once were, and most importantly, how we all want to be. You hold a mirror to the organization and encourage us to think about where we can do better, how we can be our best selves, our best Harvard. Thank you to each of you for staying connected to one another and to Harvard. Your efforts help to make this place everything that it is, and most importantly, everything that it can and will be. I hope I get to see all of you in person one of these days before too long. In the meantime, I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have on October 6th, when I'll sit down with my friend, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, to discuss in more detail the ways in which Harvard can be better, where we're going, and how we're going to get there. Until then, I hope you all enjoy the conference and one another. I wish each and every one of you the very best. And thanks again very much for being here. Take care.
Thank you so much, Larry. For those of you who have just joined us, welcome to Unity Weekend. My name is Ivanu Siram, and I currently serve as the president of the Harvard Black Alumni Society. I want to welcome you all to Unity Weekend and to this evening's conversation with Baratunde Thurston. A few housekeeping notes before we move into our program. If you have a question for Baratunde during the Q&A portion, please send it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and we will provide it to our moderator. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Our moderator for this evening is Julie Ann Crommett. She hails from the Harvard College class of 2008, where she majored in English and American Literature and Language and lived in Leverett House. Julie Ann has been working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for over a decade, leading disruptive, systemic change across media and tech. As founder and CEO of Collective Moxie, Julie Ann works with organizations large and small on revolutionizing their DEI strategies through inclusive storytelling practices, accountability, and community partnerships. Previously, Julie Ann was the vice president of multicultural audience engagement at the Walt Disney Studios, where she undertook efforts to diversify talent in front of and behind the camera to connect creative projects more closely to the communities they touch and to build a more inclusive culture within the studios. You can learn more about Julie Ann by clicking on the link in the chat. Tonight, she will sit in conversation with Baratunde Thurston. Baratunde and I overlapped at Harvard as undergraduates, and he was then, as he is now, astute, engaging, and always skilled at bringing humor and insight to the challenges of race, culture, and politics in America. Baratunde Thurston is a proud member of the Harvard College class of 1999, where he majored in philosophy and lived in Lowell House. As an executive producer, commentator, author, and advisor, Baratunde dives headfirst into hard and complex conversations with wit, wisdom, and compassion. He is an Emmy-nominated host who has worked for The Onion, produced for The Daily Show, advised the Obama White House, and authored the New York Times bestseller, How to Be Black, the television adaptation of which is now in development at ABC. Congratulations. He's the executive producer and host of How to Citizen with Baratunde, which Apple named one of its favorite podcasts of 2020. His work on that podcast also garnered him the Social Impact Award at the 2021 iHeartRadio Podcast Awards. And next spring, he will host a new PBS primetime series, America Outdoors with Baratunde Thurston. Thank you both for joining us tonight. I know that we are all excited for this conversation. So without further ado, Julie Ann, please take it away.
Oh gosh, thank you so much, Yvonne, and to the entirety of the Unity Weekend team that put this together. And Baratunde, hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
You too. Quick audio check. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay.
And you hear and see me okay?
Perfectly.
My gosh, we've made it. That's half the battle, everybody. Here
Mission
we are.
accomplished.
Mission accomplished. Well, I have to say, Baratunde, it's an honor to be joining you this evening and chatting. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've watched in awe reading about your ascent in so many different ways, and specifically in Fast Company many times. So
Long time, deep cut. I like that.
Deep
Thank
cut.
you.
I like to bring it back. Old school right there.
Yeah.
But before we dive in, I just want to echo, Yvonne, huge congratulations on the recent announcement of the adaptation of How to Be Black for ABC. Being from the television and film industry, this is no small feat to get this going. So huge, huge congratulations. Another round of applause on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's good to be here. It's good to follow Larry. I would call him President Bacow, but he wants to be Larry. So Larry, where my money at? Because they all changed the financial aid policy after I left. And I feel like I'm owed many reparations from Harvard because people today don't have to pay. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
so
no,
just Larry,
absolutely.
give me a call. And Yvonne has a dope background. I would love to know which group of politically angry Black people will feature in the background of hers. I hope she shows up to all her Zooms with that behind her, not just Unity. I want you to be in your freaking like C-suite, quarterly report joint, just rocking angry Black people behind you. They'll probably give you what you want.
That's exactly right. I
Yeah.
feel like, and by the way, we should have a rotational series that we just rotate through.
Oh,
all the meetings.
yeah.
Yes.
If this could be your company on fire, you know what I'm saying? Like, so maybe you want to give me that raise. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh my God, I love this. I'm just rocking a bunch of random stuff from Wakanda and Feminist Baby and everything going on.
You look very intelligent. You look studied. You look ready.
Thank you.
You look like someone who would cite their sources, so I'm not really gonna mess with you.
Oh no, you know what? But again, I took you back to Fast Companies. You know where this is going.
Exactly. You've done homework, so I'm on my toes now.
I love it. So with that, let's dive in. Have you always been interested in news and social change? I mean, this is the stuff that you found your heart in. And how did your time at Harvard impact that trajectory? Maybe sharing a little bit about your Harvard journey and how it played a part in that.
I have always been into the news and social change, at least for almost as long as I can remember. The news bug hit me early. My mom was an NPR lady and WPFW. I grew up in Washington, D.C. So it was always like public radio was on in the background. PBS was on in the background. That was our cable. We didn't have cable. We couldn't afford cable, but we got those extra channels higher on the dial. And those are like the people's channels. So I was always listening and reading. I would read the Sunday paper from a pretty early age. And then the interest in justice came with the skin. It was just kind of like embedded in there. And it came with the woman who brought me into this world, my mother, Baratunde Thurston, who was very much an activist herself. In fact, that image behind Yvonne could very much have been one of the many protests my mother was at, and I have a few of those myself, and it's the same kind of tone. So it's in the family. And Harvard's role in this, couple things. I mean, on the justice front, look, Harvard's a massive institution grounded in like capitalism and colonialism and like male dominance and white supremacy, and also the pursuit of truth. So that's a conflict, and conflicts are rich. It's a contradiction, and my mother always taught me to heighten the contradiction. So a place like Harvard is a fine place to explore justice. It's a necessary place to explore justice. I was a philosophy major. I was down with all the Black clubs and a few non-Black clubs and the computer clubs. And lastly, on the role of news, I did the Crimson when I was at Harvard, and I did photo and news because I didn't know how to choose stuff. Nobody at Harvard understands that predicament. And I had created my own satirical email newsletter. Anybody who's repping like class of 97 to 01, maybe 02, might remember my little newsflash email joint. And it was my version of the Onion before I knew the Onion existed. But I would try out the Crimson stuff and do that official formal journalism. And then I do my version, the Baratunde edition, through email. And in some ways, I'm still doing today all the stuff I was doing in college. But now I get way too expensive healthcare. In fact, maybe I've moved backwards because my healthcare costs more now than it did 20 years ago. And it covers less stuff. We're doing the wrong thing, America. Let's fix that.
We are absolutely doing the wrong thing. We're going to talk about that again in a minute, actually. On a side note, I'd be remiss because you honored your mother as a huge inspiration in your journey. My mom is actually on the Zoom right now and just wrote in the chat. So hi to Anna Pardo, my mom. I am
Mama Pardo. What's up?
There she is. We have to shout her because, our moms are everything. My mom is also. Absolutely. So, with that, because I can already see it in the joy in which we're already engaging here, right? Personal belief, which I think you share deeply, is that joy is our resistance, that living in a place of spirit is really important. And in all of the negativity that so many of us face, whether on a daily basis or en masse right now, right? You talk about very deeply on your podcast, How to Citizen, but you do it with such a positive outlook. with an aspect to it, right, that you're also bringing to this conversation. Where do you draw from for that? And is it hard some days, given the nature of all that we collectively have to tackle?
It's hard every day. Sometimes, Julie Ann, I just make it up. I truly just, I make up joy. I manifest it. I conjure it. I draw it from the ether and from the ancestors, and I assume it's there. And I think that is in part like a good thing, and maybe even virtuous or noble. I also know it's a survival mechanism and like necessary.
Yes.
So I don't quite have a choice in the choice I make to believe that joy is possible and that I deserve it and that I will embrace it. I think we all know some version of everyday struggle, struggle of belonging, struggle of trying to overcome, struggle of representation or being represented. And in the struggle, we can lose sight. Us, I'm not talking about white folks, I'm talking about us. We can lose sight of the thing for which we struggle. So if all we do is struggle and we don't exhibit freedom, we ain't gonna be free. We have to practice freedom in order to properly pursue freedom. So joy is a practice of freedom. It's freedom practice. Dance like nobody's watching. Rock that music too loud. Cook up a storm as slow as you need to. Smile to yourself. Take a moment to do nothing. These are the things I try. I walk. I meditate. I sleep in on occasion, and it feels like that's not enough. And I'm working on it. And it's a practice. Joy is a practice. Freedom is a practice. Love is a practice. So I'm practicing that because if not, then what's all this struggling for?
That's right. Where, if not, where are we going? If not, what does it look like?
What do you do? What do you do?
What do I do? Oh, I love this. So many things. Spending time with people who I love and who reaffirm who I am in many ways. Hence, my mom is on this Zoom because literally I texted her.
That's wonderful.
Because I have to read and watch a lot of things in my life because of my work, I try to make intentional time to read things for fun and for actually filling my creative cup. I think that something we don't talk about enough is how much the pain, the struggle, whatever we have to deal with in a particular day can actually drain out our creativity in real ways, and how much we have to be so intentional about refilling that cup. And so I find that in art that has nothing to do with my day profession, it has everything to do with feeding me. And part of that, because I'm super hipster in that way, is vinyl. I listen to vinyl specifically, jazz records. I'm a huge jazz nut. And salsa and merengue, which
okay.
Hello, mia, Dios mío. That's my Puerto Rican Cuban self right there.
Oh, work it. See, you're bringing me joy. You're bringing everybody a lot of joy just with the specificity of your descriptions. Thank you for letting me reverse the flow here a bit. That's nice.
Oh, I love it. These are the best kinds. And then we're going to reverse the flow with the audience in a minute anyway. So why not? And I think so much. So the last conversation with Franklin and Celeste and Jeff,
was dope.
Which was amazing and powerful. Everybody in the audience, he was here for it as well. And one of the things that came up in the context of art in Hollywood was, and in creative work, was this sense of scarcity, right? This model of scarcity that exists and actually permeates in many ways all of our society. If you gain something, I lose something, right? Or that there's this binary that we exist on. And we see so much of that playing out right now. Both we've seen it and we currently see it playing out in a fear-based model, especially from those in power. And it's been a driving decision in many ways on things that impact communities of color outsizedly in this country. And it's all of those things we know, right? Fear of losing control of power, fear of reallocating vital resources. Again, somehow a zero-sum game, fear of others. How do you reflect on sort of where we are in that, and sort of where do we go from here? How do we also, because this is all about unity this weekend, how do we also come together to go somewhere from here?
Easy ones. Nice.
Oh, I'm just throwing you like
nice softball.
anytime.
I'm reminded of this old quote from Dune. Excited to see that finally, hopefully, be the good version. Fear is a mind killer. How do I reflect on that? I acknowledge it first. I think that fear is a very human emotion. It's a very human response to a perception of threat. And we got a lot of folks who are perceiving threat in the modest ascendance, potentially, of a large group of people who've been subjugated for a very long time. And I think it's useful to acknowledge the validity of the emotional response. Not to countenance violence or other things that may spur from that emotion, but to acknowledge the validity of the response. I can see you're afraid. I too have been afraid. I can see you're worried about losing something. I too have lost things. So I'm you. I've been there. We share an emotional reality. I think the thing about fear that's powerful is that poorly or misdirected, it can wreak havoc. You know, the fear is real. And so the actions people can take based on that fear can be really jacked up. But also, properly processed, fear can be transformed. Fear can be a necessary step on the road to healing, to learning, and to growing. And for those of us experiencing it, or those of us on the backlash end of it, I think the lesson is the same. We should strive to find a way to see the fear as an opportunity. And there's something been on my mind for a while now, this whole critical race theory conversation, which is on the surface stupid, because the people who are most upset about it don't know what they're talking about. They hadn't heard about it before, like 7 months ago, before Tucker Carlson told them to think this about that. But their emotions are real, and they're showing up to school board meetings, and that's real, and they're firing teachers, and that's real. So what could we do differently than what most of us have been practicing? I think that the true opposite of fear is love. And I have experienced in my own growth, and I didn't always know what love was. I thought love was like a destination. You like somebody hard, you know what I'm saying? And they like you back. And it feels good. Love doesn't always feel good. My new conception of love is that love is knowing. If I'm honest about when I have felt loved, it's because the relationship in which I felt it was with someone who knew me more deeply than anyone else could, because I let them in and because they pursued, despite some of the ugly stuff they found. Oh shit, that's love. Love is knowing. So we're talking about what we're teaching our babies. And some people are upset because we're going to teach them some unflattering truths about their history. Truths, knowledge. Just it's love. You love America? You willing to know America? You willing to hear the truth about America? And still, it's easy to love somebody who makes you feel good about yourself all the time.
Absolutely.
That ain't love. You're just using them for your own ends. It's actually very selfish. A lot of us, I myself included, thought of love that way. So fear, understandable. Some people need help. In fact, I'd say all of us need help properly converting that fear to something close to love. You know, even if we get on the path, it's better than the destruction, which is often the outcome of fear. And I think many of us who are on the receiving end of that fear don't always know how to creatively respond to that, because we're afraid too. We're afraid of losing more stuff too. So it becomes this vicious spiral. And I am looking for an opportunity to flip that whole dynamic. All right. How do we convert fear to love? How do we talk about these things differently? How do we reframe the challenge? Not why am I not patriotic, but can you deeply love America? Can you deeply believe in America enough to trust America to handle her truths? So now I'm not on the back foot no more.
That's right.
But my offense is still loving and respectful. It's an experiment. We'll see how it goes.
I'm taking that in because that resonated so deep. People are blowing up the chat, by the way. That's resonated so deeply because isn't that really the exercise at the end of the day that we're called to do with each other on a deep level?
Yeah, and it's hard.
It is hard.
We want shortcuts, Julie Ann. Like,
right.
And I'm trying to say we a lot because I'm a person. You know, I'm a dude. All right. So half of me inherited shit I didn't earn. And I can remember these conversations about the pay gap and we got to pay women more. And I can hear my brethren being nervous. What does that mean for me? What are they going to take from me to give to them? Right? Us and them. What are they going to take from me to give to her, who's presumably undeserving? And then here's what happened. My wife gets paid more. Our household gets more money. We get paid. And this mythical separation, this us and them, is self-defeating. It's all we. There really ain't the you and the me. We could bring in the quantum physicists in here to prove it, but you know, this whole thing is kind of a construct. And that there's power in that, you know, because we can interpret it differently. But that zero-sum mentality that Heather McGhee writes about so beautifully in The Sum of Us, kind of one of the most deep and recent versions of this age-old realization, highly recommend it. And it just helped me. And that's the last piece. I think I'm practicing and I'm trying to put myself in the story or in the advice or in the lesson. Because I'm like, you can't teach shit you haven't learned. And so it's all good to just like listen to some random Black person, some random person of color tell you what to do about race shit. But like, what are we learning too? You know, like I'm not just trying to just like dole out lessons. Like I'm trying to grow too. And so there's things that I need to learn and get better at too. And I think if I can try to approach humbly some of this work and say, yo, I feel that too. I'm afraid too. I have been very nervous about some of these changes too. And yet I'm still here.
Yep.
I'm intact. We can be okay. I went a little long on that, but thank you.
No, it was perfect. And somebody else wrote in the chat just now, and Muhammad wrote, and unlearning things as well.
Oh, yeah,
Which I just had to say, because that was just, as Muhammad, thank you for that, because that is the other part of it. It's not just the learning, it's the unlearning.
Yeah.
Right. All the things that are put into us from this crazy place that we live in. Right. You know, it's really interesting because that exact spirit of sort of The Sum of Us, by the way, a lot of people plugged the book by Heather McGhee in the chat as well, came up in the last conversation with Franklin Celeste, really tying into that storytelling piece. And actually, because you're a storyteller and we're looking at, right, that idea of what is love and seeing the whole, right, and the piece about sort of how do we actually take that and be continual learners and unlearners in comedy, specifically in comedy. It right now is really tough. Anybody I know who's a comedy writer, satirist, this is an interesting time to be in that space on multiple levels. And I'm curious and curious for our audience to know, as you have been growing in your comedic voice and really thinking about that continual learning and unlearning, what are some thoughts or words of advice that you have on hitting it in the comedy space in terms of connecting, landing the laugh, which quite frankly is how we know something is funny, to be honest, right? Is that it elicits the response. And are there some lessons you've learned over the years, maybe when something didn't actually land the way you thought it would, and that actually made you have to do some more introspection on your own kind of learning, unlearning journey?
I made a a passing remark in a recent email dispatch. Recommend Check me out at newsletter.baratunde.com.
Recommend That's amazing.
Yeah, my name is quite the extensible markup language. So I love applying it to things or having things apply to it. I was commenting, it's kind of a spiral, it's short, but it's a spiral. I was commenting on the Texas abortion decision and trying to find my rage through my words that could still be heard in some ways because of, in other ways, in spite of the rage. And I was making a comparison because Mexico have recently decriminalized abortion. And I was like, even the narco state, the nearly failed narco state to the south has figured out that women are more than just things. Why can't the great Republic of Texas do the same? And in my head, I was like, yo, you got that, yo, you boo, boo, boo. And one of my readers wrote back, Mexican reader, and I was like, bro, this is not it. Like, I don't appreciate that. I see what you were trying to do, but it kind of broke my heart to see you just like slide into this stereotype, like we're not just a narco state. Can you please try better, do harder, do better, try harder, some version of those things.
Right.
That was like 2 weeks ago. I mean, you can tell by the timing of the events, this is not like some 10-year-old thing I have to dig out of my Twitter feed. It's like, oh, that was embarrassing. So I had to unlearn some stuff. I wrote an apology back. I was like, yo, you're right. Even in trying to like undermine certain stereotypes, I can play into others. And like, I'm a product of this system too. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I will try to do better. And I'm sorry for hurting you. So humility is a part of this. It was a good joke that also hurt people. So it wasn't a great joke. And I could do better. Like, there are other ways to make that kind of point and make that comparison. I think humor's power is profound. I think, it can get at some of the emotional parts of us and bypass a lot of this cerebral thinking. With power comes responsibility. And I think all of us need to be open to, whether we are practicing this form of art or participating in it as recipients, audience members, critics, and judges, to learning and unlearning and seeing, what people are trying to put down. I mean, I think Chappelle's latest special was wild and super interesting to me because I think my take is he was operating at a transgressive, deep level of critique and commentary. And it's also fascinating for me to watch who picks up what piece, right? Like, who's like, he's totally unacceptable at all because of the way he framed this bit. Other people are like, oh, he's really finding the human frailty in all of us. And that even within our movements, we have splits. Like, that's a really cool analysis within the left. It's rich, and art is never just one thing. So I'm learning and I'm fascinated to see like where things go. Advice, keep taking risks. We're all going to mess up. I'm messing up actively right now.
Yes.
And I'm learning through it. And I think if we set perfection as a bar, then we're not going to get to where we want to get to. And I think if we are willing to abandon whole human beings for, I'm glad my reader didn't be like, I'm done with Baratunde forever.
Right.
That would have been a missed opportunity for both of us. And certainly, like, I've been out in the streets physically at times saying like, people aren't as bad as their worst mistakes, criminal justice reform now. And it's like, oh, so I should probably practice that too.
Right.
That's inconvenient, but useful. So it's a mix of things. Thank you for a thoughtful question that I'm still clearly processing.
No, absolutely. And it's so funny, like we're all learning in real time, even in DEI work, a lot of the things I say to people is I'm not asking you to be perfect, I'm asking you to be better.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're talking about here, right?
And then people can get like, it's real slippery because there's folks who are new to feeling criticism.
Yes.
And so the skin is so thin and the ego so fragile And it's like, but you didn't give me a cookie and 5 gold stars? What?
What?
And the waterworks begin and their life is over. And you're like, so you weren't lauded for breathing? Welcome to humanity.
Right.
So it's, again, we all have some thing to play on the criticism side of this, but on humor, like if you're into it, like, please just write, keep writing, take notes, observe, push the bounds and play and mess up and get back up again. We need art of all kind to help us process this madness.
That's absolutely correct. And a lot of people are riffing on what you were just talking about as well. And as somebody even applauding you for taking in the feedback and going back out to your, the follower who called you out and then got better, right? You actually,
well, the next thing now I got to put it in the main newsletter, right? So
Right.
It's one thing to have the side conversation. Yo, I hear you, homie. Thank you so much for that. What's up, my public? Love me, love me, love me.
Right.
So check the next newsletter and see if I acknowledge it publicly, and I'll be practicing getting better.
That's 100% right. By the way, I will share a side note. I was actually once hosting a talk on unconscious bias many, many, many years ago. And I actually, during doing that actual talk, assumed that a woman's manager was a man and called myself out in the middle of the session. So I just want to, this is just pernicious, folks, what we're trying to say. But that's the thing, is that you have to approach it with that growth mindset. And to your point, the level of fragility for, I like to say, the folks that are still in preschool, which are the folks that, have been in the majority and not had to deal with this as much. And a lot of us have PhDs and kind of everything in between. And that's what we're dealing
Literally.
with. Right?
It's not fair. It's kind of comical. I mean, there's comedy in that. I should do some. It's literal PhDs running around, trying to help preschoolers get better at race. And like, we might be grading them on like a grad school scale.
Correct.
So we could go a little more gentle. They also need to recognize they're just in preschool, and like, your little boo-boo is going to be fine.
Exactly right. Yes. And you'll get your little Marvel themed Band-Aid, and then we will continue to move forward. Yes. And I know we only have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I'm looking to see if we have any questions from the audience. And Jennifer Kahn asked, how do we build up those fragile egos? Which I think is such a really interesting follow-up question to what we were just talking about. And then we have another one from Sheila after that.
It's hard because you don't want to coddle and indulge self-pity. And someone who's like, waterworks and the whole, it's going to be okay. Let's just say Karen, it's going to be okay. Like, but also like further shaming, not productive for them or for us. So not in public. Modeling grace in public actually is, I think, really good practice. Identifying with, reminding people like your life's not over, and just like a little metaphorical slap, like you're statistically speaking, you're going to be fine. This whole system was set up so you'd be fine. So you're probably going to be fine. But I understand you're hurt. I feel you. Maybe you pause the thing. Maybe you take a moment. Maybe you pace it. Maybe they need someone who's like them to help them. When we think about learning, the teacher matters. And I might listen to someone who looks and feels like me much more, especially when I'm having a hard time, especially when I think this is some bullshit, this is too hard, I didn't sign up for this. Then I might need to hear from someone in the 3rd grade that tells me preschool doesn't last forever. And like, pretty soon you'll be rocking the hula hoop or whatever. Clearly I don't have kids. I don't know the stages of development and growth or what have you, but there's life after this moment. And so for those of us who are not that person for this avatar we've invented, maybe we need to find someone to help hold their hand that isn't us, so that they don't get in our way.
That's right.
Because it is in our interest to have them move forward with us, and certainly not to shame them so hard that we drive them into the arms of our opponents so that they become further obstacles. That's literally how some Nazis get made. It's because they get
Yes.
turned off by people shaming them for not being correct enough on the
Mhm.
social justice tip, on the woke tip. I've
Mhm.
seen it happen. I've heard
Yes.
about it happening in other circles. That's an own goal. That's a preventable loss. So it's not just about coddling them. It's also self-interest.
Absolutely. And it, by the way, just as a side comment, Meira, and apologies if I mispronounced it, actually wrote, wouldn't it be nice if we could just tell Karen to pull herself up by her bootstraps? On a side note, I didn't want that one.
See, and that feels
one
real
to
good.
pass us by.
That feels
Yeah.
real good. But then Karen's gonna go find a QAnon chat room and storm the Capitol again. So, you know, like,
That's that is exactly right. I know we only have time for two more, so we're gonna do
Okay.
Sheila's question and I'll flip to our last one. But given Hollywood's impact on the culture of this country and its power to influence and transform, what do both of you feel they get right, and what do you want to see change and how?
I've talked a lot. Do you mind taking this first, Julie Ann?
Sure, no problem at all. I mean, I think for me, I think some of the things that have been going the right way, but we're nowhere where we need to go, is you're starting to see a shift, right? And Franklin and Celeste talked about this a bunch as well. As you're starting to see a shift in diversity of narrative, both on screen and behind the camera, meaning that we're starting to see a more expansive view, quite frankly, of ourselves that exist on this call, and the stories that are told about us and quite frankly by us. And that needs to happen more and more. And that's what I'd flip to, is that I think there's a few things, right? There's a question around funding and the actual financial support of content from folks who look like all of us and who live lives like all of us on this call and beyond. And I think the other part of that is really flipping a script on its head in terms of, you know, actually it was Celeste who said this in the last panel, and it's absolutely right, which is so much of what happens right now in this current system is that there's only room for sort of one of us or one of our stories, and that somehow defines the narrative. And I think for me, they asked in the last panel, what would success look like? And I think, first of all, at a very high level, it's the abundance of stories that we have not seen to date that start to reshape the narrative, not only about what we believe about ourselves at a very fundamental heart level, but also what others who are not of our particular background or intersection of identities believes about us. And that's where the true cultural change comes from in my head. The other thing is the opportunity to fail equally, which they talked about in the last panel. And I couldn't agree more, because the burden of proof is insanely too high on each and every single one of us. And all of us who are Harvard grads, I think, understand that at an insanely deep level, I shall say. So how about you?
We will know we have succeeded when we're allowed to fail and keep going.
Yeah.
That's really dope. That last panel was great on that question. Hollywood, you know, calls itself like the creative capital of the world, something like that. And it's a awkward title to claim in some respects for an industry that is built on like milking the last drop of marrow out of the bones of the same old story over and over and over again.
There are 4 There's a Star Is Born movies. If we just take, there are 4. Anyway.
So much reminding. Like, you already done strip mined this hill. It's just poison, and you going back in for some more. And you know what Hidden Figures did for me was like open up a whole frame of thought around all the stories we think we know, but we don't, because we only know it from one perspective. I saw a trailer for another World War II movie recently, and it was like, this plane goes down and they have plans and the Germans are going to do a thing, and these small group of dudes has to cross this field with another group of dudes to get this message to a group of dudes. And I was like, yo, there's so many stories. My wife is talking about this, you know, her grandmother's story is like incredible. We have parallel versions of the things. And I think a modest step for Hollywood to take is, okay, yes, you can make 50 more World War II movies. It was the greatest war from an American perspective in recent history bias. But there's still so many different stories. If it truly was a world war, why don't we have a world perspective on it? Why don't we hear from like half of the population that also sacrificed and kept shit going? in the meantime. I'd love to see things like that in the world.
I'm totally in agreement. And, a fun exercise I always like to challenge people to do is take who is traditionally a side character in a story, which is usually all of us, make them the protagonist. And what is that story? What is that
it's a
movie?
simple
And
storytelling
it's
hack. That's a
simple.
good writing exercise. They should teach it in film school.
No, I will make a plug. I'm teaching a class on inclusive storytelling at Columbia Film School this fall. And we got to be doing
when you're
this.
on a Harvard Zoom and you say shit like that, this is the Zoom where it happens. I'm like, somebody should teach a class. Oh, well, okay. Well, I'll just work that into my curriculum in Columbia. Okay, good.
You just did a Zoom where it happens. Thank you so much for that. I know we have to wrap it up, but one last word. If everybody here could take away one word or one phrase of how we can continue to drive change, right? And actually go deeper in that sense of love that you described, what would that one word or phrase be?
Oh, wow. Okay. The word that came to mind was breathe. So let's everybody do that together. Let's actually do it. Let's not say the word. Let's be it. I think when we really breathe, we feel and we connect and we exchange. And those are some of the things we need to do to sustain ourselves, to reconnect, to sustain, to take in, and also to give back. It's a cycle that we're a part of. We're not the beginning, we're not the end. We're constantly in the middle. We're literally in the flow. And I think breath is a great, simple reminder of a lot more complex principles like that.
Amazing. And well, on that note, Baratunde, can I just say thank you. Thank you for sharing tonight. Thank you for bringing us that, and for the beauty of love and change that we're going to take with us throughout this whole Unity weekend and beyond. So just please, everybody, join me in thanking Baratunde for this incredible conversation. It's been an honor. And I want to hand it back to my Latina sister in change, the beautiful Glenda. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. And I threw a phone number in the chat, 202-894-8844. Text me, you can sign up on a little text joint I got. Socials are accessible. Been such a pleasure. Julie Ann, you are wonderful. This was really engaging and fun. Your mama, she should be so proud. Thank you.
We love you, Mama Pardo. Awesome. And anybody, sending love to everybody.
Thank you so much, Baratunde and Julie Ann, for that thoughtful, honest, grounding, and inspiring conversation. There is so much to unpack. And I know that I will certainly be much more intentional about acting on joy as a practice of freedom, which is in itself such a freeing thought. So thank you. I also, Julie Ann, I feel compelled to say hi to your mom. So hola, mami de Julie Ann. So again, thank you so much for that uplifting exchange.
Yvonne, you on mute. Oh, it's a classic Zoom moment.
Apologize.
She's on mute.
Thank you both so much for that fantastic conversation. We were thrilled to have you both with us. And before we conclude this evening, we wanted to remind you all to please join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. for the Unity Weekend Story Slam, which will feature 5 captivating performances of Harvard alumni, poised to move us all to laughter, tears, and inspiration.
And on Saturday, join us for our environmental justice, entrepreneurship, and equity in K-12 education panels.
And that's it for our opening night of Unity Weekend. Thank you all for joining us for this historic event. See you tomorrow.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
And good to see you, Yvonne.
Good to see you too. And congratulations.
Thank you. Oh, what's the background though?
Oh, it's actually from the Crimson. It's from an article that showed kind of a protest and a separate, I guess, memorial service that Black students at Harvard threw for Martin Luther King Jr. And it's them
Wow.
leaving that memorial service in droves.
That's beautiful. Well done.
It's from 1968. I think it was in the Harvard Crimson, April 10th of 1968.
What a year. Y'all did a great job with this program. Thank you for including me. I will sign off now. Peace.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you, Baratunde. So good to meet you.